This is Only the Strong Survive, a podcast powered by Con Media, where we dive deep into the world of business, leadership, and innovation. I'm your host, Dan Kahn, and I'm honored to have you join us today. So, let's get ready to learn some survival skills together. Hey everybody, welcome back to Only the Strong Survive. I am your host, Dan Kahn, and today we are very fortunate to have a great guest with us, Norris Marshall, the man behind BluePrint Engines and several other companies that we're going to talk about today. What started as a very small operation in a garage in Nebraska has grown into one of the largest manufacturers of internal combustion engines in the country. And he has a great story. He's a client, he's a friend, and I'm really excited for this one. So first of all, Norris, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Dan, happy to be here. It's nice to meet your audience. I'm sure it's a lot of people I've never met before.
Just to kind of kick things off, Norris, you run a really interesting business. And like I mentioned, you are a client. And before you were a client, I got to know you a bit through SEMA, and I've used your product on a couple of my project cars. And the more I get to know you and your team and get to visit your facility, the more impressed I am. It's pretty rare, I think, these days to meet someone in manufacturing who's bootstrapped all the way and is as passionate about not just their product, but their people as you are. So I'm excited to get into it. Give us the kind of Reader's Digest background on you and your career and kind of where you started and where you are today in terms of the business, because I think it's an interesting story.
I'm in Kearney, Nebraska right now, and I grew up about 15 miles from here on a farm. So I was a farm kid growing up. My mom and dad had a business in town. They were in the auction business and they sold livestock. But my summer times were full of baling hay and irrigating corn and things like that until I got to be a teenager. And then I was able to finagle a job in town. This is a little town of like 800 people. And I worked at the one and only repair shop in that town in the summertime. My mom would take me to work. They taught me how to work on lawnmower engines because they service lawnmowers and nobody wanted to do it. So that was kind of the beginning. And it didn't take too long before I figured out I really liked working in a shop environment. I liked engines and cars. That's really what I wanted to do as opposed to being a farmer growing up. So when I was in high school, I was able to get a job in my senior year. In the afternoons, I would work at an automotive machine shop that was in the back of a parts store, like a lot of machine shops were at the time. And I learned the trade of engine machining and crank grinding and block boring and valve jobs and those kind of things. And I was taught that by the machinist that was there. About halfway through my senior year of high school, the machinist quit. And my boss said, "I think you got this." So I was a senior in high school running this one-man machine shop, really less than one man because I was only there in the afternoons. And I hired some guys and trained them and really enjoyed that kind of work. I always liked working on engines a little bit better than just working on the car. The engine, the precision part was more fun. After a few years of doing that, I really had an entrepreneurial drive. And I remember talking to my bosses at that parts store about, could I buy in? Could I become their partner? And of course, I'm sure looking back now, that sounded pretty silly that here's this 20-year-old kid that thinks he's going to buy into our parts store. So I did what, you had to do. I quit and opened my own machine shop because I wanted to be in business. So that first machine shop gig, Marshall Engine Service, I had a loan for $3,500, bought a bunch of used equipment, boring bars, valve grinders, things like that. Made equipment like the press. You had to have a hydraulic press. I made that. I had to have a hot tank. I made that. And that's what we started doing. Before long, I had an employee and then 2 and 3, and we were just doing engine machine work. So that was the beginning of it.
Was that mostly like full rebuilds, or was it just sort of whatever came across the transom?
It was whatever they brought in. Back then, it was not uncommon for some shops to specialize in overhauls. So they'd bring you the block and heads and crank and the sheet metal and have you hot tank it. And we'd sell them an engine kit that had all the parts in it. And we just did the machine work. And then they'd take it back to their shop and put it together. That was really pretty common. But back then, the engines would wear out in 75 or 80,000 miles too. They're a lot better today.
I mean, I think I've told you this story that, my first job was working at PAW, Performance Automotive Warehouse, and we sold a ton of those rebuild kits, where it was a box of pistons and all the gaskets you needed and cam bearings and a bunch of other bearings. And half the time the guy would do it wrong and blow up the motor and come back and buy a second one. And, that was pretty common back then. I don't want to derail this story because I want to keep going, but can you take a minute to explain the motor that's sitting in your showroom? Because I think that's a really cool part of your story.
So as mentioned, as a teenager, I decided I wanted to be in the engine business. I wanted to work on engines for a career. Back then, we got paper magazines, and I used to get Hot Rod magazine and Carcraft magazine. And as soon as they'd show up, I'm reading them cover to cover and absorbing. And I actually did learn a lot from those magazines. But I think it was Hot Rod magazine, and maybe September of 1977, there was a story in there about how Jack Roush had taken a 302 Ford Windsor and turned it into a 302 Ford Boss. And you used Cleveland heads, 289 rods. You had to modify the heads a little bit for the way the water ran through the Windsor, and then you needed a 302 Boss intake manifold. So I thought that looks like a great first project for me because I kind of like Fords. So I found a used engine in the newspaper, a 302. Found some four barrel Cleveland heads at a salvage yard about 40 miles away. My mom took me over there and we bought them. I hauled it all into this machine shop that I eventually would work at. Gave them the magazine article and said, "This is what I want." So they did the machine work. I got it home and I got it all put back together. Found the right parts. I think along the way I realized that the one part I didn't have was the intake manifold. According to the magazine article, there were two intake manifolds. One, the one that Ford made, 302 Boss production intake manifold, or two, Edelbrock had one, and the Edelbrock one was pretty expensive. Again, we're going back to 1977. Communication is different than it is today. So I wanted to buy a used manifold, and I wanted to get it from Jack Roush. So I called information and said, "I need a phone number for Jack Roush in Livonia, Michigan." And they gave me a number. And I called. I said, "I want to talk to Jack Roush." And he was the one that answered the phone. Of course, his world was smaller then, right? It was a long time ago. So he wasn't the rock star that he is today. And I said, "I built this engine according to this magazine article. I need a manifold." He said, "I'll sell you one." So he sold me the intake manifold still sitting on the engine out there. I bought it from him for $75. He sent it to my house. I think my mom probably paid for it. She's very supportive of my hobbies. And we've kept that engine. Ultimately, I put it in a 69 Ford pickup that was a hand-me-down from the hired man. Took the pickup in the barn, painted it red with yellow flames on it, put that engine in it, and that kind of became my high school daily driver for a while.
That's pretty cool. And it's super cool that you still have it and that it's sitting in the showroom as kind of the root of your whole enterprise.
Yeah. I don't really know Jack Roush. I've met him several times and I've told him that story a few times and he always smiles. I think he's starting to recognize that he's heard it before. But a guy like him, you just don't know how many people you're impacting throughout your life. And I wanted him to know how he impacted me.
I mean, ironically, and I don't think I've talked to you about this, I read that article. My first car was a 68 Mustang that I restored with my dad in the garage. And I wanted that motor so bad and I couldn't afford it. So we did the next best thing and we just found an old blown up 351 Windsor and just rebuilt it, but couldn't do the Cleveland heads and all that. But it's pretty neat. That clever, I think clever was what they called it, right? Like a clever motor or something? Yeah.
Like a Cleavor. I think a Cleveland heads on a 351 Windsor is a Cleavor.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is a great combination. You get more cubic inch out of it.
So you're rebuilding motors, you're doing machine work, you got a couple of employees, you're running mostly used kind of equipment. What happens? Because I think this next part of your story is really interesting because you took some steps that not a lot of people take.
I was probably 22 years old, maybe 23, and I realized I'd been to several machine shops besides the one I worked at. And I realized that I probably had, from an employee standpoint, about as big a machine shop as I had ever seen. And I thought, we're just going to do this for the next 40 years. And that did not seem very appealing to me. I really like a challenge. So I knew I wanted to change what we were doing. I knew it needed to be something to do with engines because that's what I knew about and understood, and that's what the equipment would work on. And I always remember, Dan, looking in the Automotive Engine Rebuilders Association trade publication rosters. So this is a trade group that all the machine shops in the country belong to, or most of them did. Anybody that was machining engines belonged to this group. And they had a roster that showed all their members and what city they were in and how many employees they had. And I was listed in there, Marshall Engine Service, 3 or 4 or whatever it was. And I remember looking at a company in Kansas, in Hutchinson, Kansas, Consolidated Manufacturing, Hutchinson, Kansas, 322. Now, I don't know what those guys do for sure, but I want to do it because I'm not sure if I can get to 323 employees, but I know I can get to 322 because somebody's already did it. And as it turned out, they were what then was called a production engine remanufacturer. They would take used engines, remanufacture them to like new factory specs, and sell them. So they weren't working on customer products. They were taking engines, rebuilding them, and selling them. So immediately I changed. And that's what we started doing. I'm sure there was some overlap where we kept taking in customer products, but I went out to the salvage yards and wherever I could find them, and I'd buy used engines. And then I found out about core suppliers that would ship truckloads of used engines, and we just started rebuilding engines, and I put an ad in the newspaper, my newspaper and little towns up and down Interstate 80 here in Nebraska, and started selling engines, 302 Fords, 350 Chevys. There wasn't that many. It was 5 or 6 part numbers would cover most of it. A lot of them went into pickups. Hired a salesman. Started signing up independent parts stores where the owners actually worked at the parts store, not the big chain deal. And it just grew. And it grew to the point where in 2000, I think our biggest month was March of 2000. We were doing 103 engines a day, and we had like 30 salesmen around the country, and it was working great. And then after that, it started slowing down. Every month would get a little bit smaller. And then I noticed my friends in the industry who did what I did, because we had a trade association. I knew all the other engine manufacturers. Some of them started going broke. I'd go to their auctions and I'd buy equipment. I remember going to California and buying some camshaft regrinding machines and thinking, wow, these are really cheap. And then I realized that's what mine are worth too. Everything's cheap. And then we finally figured out, usually when you have a downturn, you think, well, it's going to come back. It's going to come back. Well, we finally figured out, some of the smart guys in the industry said it's never coming back. Engines used to be wore out at 80,000 miles. Now with fuel injection and ECMs, they're lasting at 200,000. People are pulling 150,000 mile engines out of the salvage yard and putting them in their kids' cars. The amount of remanufactured engines that the world needs shrank in a very short period of time. Kind of like Kodak film, right? Kodak had all the imaging going on, and then in a 10-year time, it disappeared and nobody needs film. So we're back to need to change what we do. We need to be more viable. I remember towards the tail end of the engine remanufacturing, we were doing business with one of the major auto parts chains like AutoZone or somebody like that, Advance. And they were pushing us to make more money on the engines and wanted us to take less margin and lower their price. And I told my sales manager, I said, no, we're not going to do that. Tell them no. And if they throw us out, they throw us out. And of course, they threw us out. And 3 months later, I told him, I said, get back in there, give them whatever they want. I don't have anybody to sell this stuff to. So it was really not very rosy. The good part is that was the beginning of BluePrint. So it's the same thing. We have equipment. We know about engines. We know how to make engines. What can we do with that knowledge and that equipment that somebody actually wants to buy? And we started doing the BluePrint performance engines, which really in a lot of ways was kind of cool, because when I first started the machine shop, my original customers were stock car and drag racers, right? So I always liked that. I just didn't know you could make a living doing it. Started making BluePrint engines, performance engines, eventually put more and more new content in them, which you could buy, and eventually started designing our own content, sourcing product globally. So now we make an entirely new engine, and most of the designs for the heads, rods, nuts, and bolts, all that are our designs, kind of winding our own watch.
For the listeners who aren't deep into the gearhead thing, just to kind of recap, so your business up until that point was rebuilding engines, which was it sounds like mostly not performance stuff, right? It was mostly kind of daily driver, get a block, recondition it, hone it, bore it, whatever, maybe turn the crank, but it's a lot of like new bearings, new gaskets, make everything fresh, but it's a rebuild. And then, so it sounds like I didn't actually know that. So in the beginning of BluePrint, it was still rebuilds. It was just performance rebuilds. And then it transitioned into the new stuff.
At the very earliest stage, I'd say it was a rebuild engine with a different cam. And then it became a rebuild engine with new heads and a new crank. And then it's like, we really need our own block. We want to make our own block. So we went out and made our own engine block, which is a big step. Now it's 100% new. And then we took that strategy and rolled it through more than just, quote, the small block Chevy, and said, okay, everything's going to have this. We're going to spend $1 million an engine to develop all new parts. And when we have it, we own it, unlimited supply chain. We can make quality changes however we want to. Hopefully the volume will allow us to afford to be able to do it. So we're really in a unique position where we're the only niche manufacturer, somebody that can do 5,000 or 10,000 pieces a year. There's really nobody else like that. The Fords and GMs, of course, are geared to do millions and millions of engines a year. And since then, we've actually found other markets besides performance crate engines that want engines. And that's our industrial side, which today is generators. A lot of standby generator companies use us in brand new generators. We've got a company that does forestry products like wood chippers and stump grinders, and they use our engines. Lots of things to do with engines.
I remember I don't think I had gone to the magazines yet. I think I was still working at PAW, and I think GM had always had the Target Master, kind of replacement stuff. But I remember when the first performance crate motors first came out, I think it was sort of hazy on the consumer side about where these engines were coming from. And I think sort of the assumption, whether it was right or not, was that, oh, well, this says GM on it or this says Ford on it. So this is being made at some, Rouge plant that's owned by Ford or something. And I don't think any of us ever really did the math to say, wait, this is a 351 Windsor crate motor. And I think at that time, maybe they were still building Windsors for F-150s or something. But today, I think your main competitors are the OEMs, but
right,
they're not putting those motors in anything. So where are those motors coming from if you're getting a crate motor from a Chevy or a Ford?
They're assembled for Ford and Chevy under contract by a subcontractor. We know who they are. They're people we've known in the industry for a long time. A lot of times they're an engine remanufacturer that is bidding on assembly work.
Well, that was my point. I don't know that the consumer totally knows that like actually BluePrint is what it is, right? Like you guys are an engine factory and you're making your own parts, you're designing your own parts. It's all new content. I don't know that there's a ton of clarity as to where all the other stuff is coming from. And one of the things about BluePrint I think is really interesting is how transparent you are. Like you want people to come to your factory. You want people to see the tour. You want people to know what you guys are putting in those motors because you're proud of it. Like you're making it all in-house, which is really cool. But we'll get to Origin in a minute. We decided to go into the crate motor business. What was that learning curve like? Because it sounds like you weren't super heavily involved in the aftermarket, like the performance aftermarket up to that point. It was more like rebuilding. So was there resistance or was that sort of an easy transition? What was that like?
I don't think it was a really hard transition, but we did not have a recognizable brand name. And so nobody had heard of us. So we had to do some marketing to help overcome that. And we always tried to be careful to stay in our lane. In the performance engine world, you can be talking about $5,000 hot rod engines, or you can be talking about $100,000 cup engines or whatever. And we never claimed to be something we weren't. And we've always been in the more daily driver performance world. And it just took time. I mean, that was probably in 2010 or earlier when we started doing BluePrint, probably 2005. That's been a long time. It's 20 years ago that we began, and now it looks really great. And yeah, we have a wonderful plant. We like to show people what we do. But there was struggles in gaining market share, and it always was true that GM Performance was the big dog. We competed against the guy that was the OEM, whether he did the assembly work or not. Everybody knew it was GM, and they liked the part that they gave them comfort. So we just slowly built the brand and built the reputation to where we really are competing hard, and we win a lot of business against GM because we've done all the right things and treated people the right way.
So that's a great transition to something I wanted to talk about. So let's talk about your culture for a minute, because as someone who's spent really my entire life in sort of automotive and the aftermarket, and I've known a lot of founders. Culture is not sort of traditionally something that gets talked about a lot in the aftermarket. And I think it's probably better now than it was 20 years ago. But most of my experience has been people are like, well, we're going to make this product and we're going to make it as well as we can, get a good margin and grow our business. And there's not a lot of conversation about like culture or employees, or it's just like, no, we're just going to go make these products. And if you don't like it, get out. I'll hire someone else. Your organization is really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you got to where you are and kind of what your current system is for running your company? Because your team is more bought in on your mission than any team I've ever interacted with. It's really impressive.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I guess the culture comes from me and how I want to treat our employees and how I expect our managers to treat our employees. I start off with the idea that everybody wants to do a good job, and you just got to find a way to let them. And I also do believe that people are capable of a lot more than what we realize if we challenge them and encourage them. So I'm big on both challenging and encouraging. I got a lot of push. I'm not easy to work for, but at the same time, I'm on their side and I want to help them. And then I think you got to make it personal, right? People need to know that you care about them. When the moment arises that you really need to show that, you need to show up, right? If they have something happen to their family or some kind of emergency, you show up and say, how can I help? Outside of work, what do you need? How can I help you? I've learned all that from watching other people that had great cultures and decided I really like that and I want to be like that. I think a lot of who we are in life comes from meeting individuals. We say, I really like this part of Joe and I really like this part of Tom or whatever, and I'm going to try to become like that. So I've picked up those pieces, but that's how I want to treat people. And I ask my subordinate managers that you need to treat people like that too. And there's just nothing wrong with it. And it's good vibes and it's positive, and people want to get on that train and they want to be part of that. And now we get to the point where they don't want to let me down, for crying out loud. I mean, that's how committed they are, is they don't want to do something that and have them feel like they're letting me down. I had an employee mention to me a couple months ago. I don't remember what we were talking about. He wasn't anybody I work with a lot, but I've known him for years. He's been here for years. We talking about something. He said, I've never seen you do that. I said, what? He said, I've never seen you get angry. He said, I've never heard you blow up at anybody. And I said, well, I don't think that does a heck of a lot of good. It's an emotional outburst, but it doesn't really help. And I think you get people more committed by treating them well, showing them that you care. That's what we try to do. Something else I learned, Dan, I was at a convention one time, and one of my peers, companies, competitors gave a presentation on how they train their employees. And they had this guy that gave the presentation. He was in charge of corporate training. And they had like 700 employees. And it was just amazing the things that they did. And this guy, you could tell he was really good at doing corporate training. He knew how to do it. He knew the delivery mechanisms. He understood how many hours different levels of people in the organization need. He got all done. And I went over and talked to him. I said, "How did you get so good at this?" Oh, I said, "I just kind of go training." I said, "Where'd you come from?" He said, "I used to work in their warehouse." And I realized then that great companies are made up of awesome people that are really just regular people that were given a chance to be great. So everybody's got some of that greatness in them. This guy was awesome because he came out of the warehouse and he conquered this, but they provided the tools. They gave him the encouragement. So I just realized, when you're looking at your competitor and you're admiring their people, if you can't admire your people, you probably need to do more to try to develop and train them, because it's in most of them to be really great at something. So I do that. We try to make them all great.
I've seen that happen in real time on your team. In just the time we've worked together, which isn't all that long, you plucked someone out of the factory floor and put him into a customer service position that is on some of our calls, and she's phenomenal. And you can tell that she's just thrilled to be there. How do you do that? How do you identify, or how does I know it's not just you, how does your team identify that, and how does that all work?
Well, I think in that case, it was just a job posting that we were going to hire somebody, and if you wanted to apply, you could. And I know when the sales manager and the retail sales manager interviewed her, they were impressed from the beginning. So I'm sure there's things that she didn't have, but those are things you can learn, right? And then culturally, they're going to get asked, what are you doing to develop her? What's your path? What are you telling her? What are you going to do? What are the steps? What's she going to learn next week and next month? And what shows are you going to take her to or whatever to open her eyes? So there's an expectation at that middle level. You don't just have these people. You got to do something with them. How are you growing her? So that's a common question. Like, I meet with a lot of managers once a week for an hour, one-on-ones. I will ask that question a lot. It's like, what are you doing to grow your people? How are you helping them become more than they are now? And the reality is, hell, I remember when I didn't know anything. So everything I know is something I've learned. So why wouldn't we think other people can learn?
I love that. Just like you said earlier, I'm very aware of the fact that most of the learning I do is me emulating other people that I look up to. And I'm doing that right now with you. Because the first time I went to your facility, it was an interesting exercise. You had me meet with a bunch of your kind of team leads individually, one at a time. I don't know if this was part of your plan or not, but one of the things that came out of that experience was at least 2 or 3 of them over the course of a day of these kind of one-on-one meetings on their own, unprompted. I didn't ask them. They just volunteered. Norris got me this mentor, and my mentor is so-and-so, and this is what we're working on. They were very proud of the fact that you saw enough in them that you were willing to go outside of your organization and find a mentor for them. Is that something you've always done? Like, where did that come from? Because you're clearly making an impression on these folks with that.
I couldn't have done what I did without having mentors. And I've had several, but 2 of them really come to mind that were really important to me, that worked with me for a long time. One was a guy that lived in Arkansas, and he'd come and see me a couple times a year. And in between that, we'd trade emails, and he taught me a lot. And then the other one was a guy that was the dean of the School of Business at the college. Him and I really clicked, and I met with him once a week for probably 10 years. The whole relationship was clearly defined that he was a mentor. My job was to listen to him, not tell him how smart I am. And he really became kind of like a family consigliere. Because he was familiar with the educational system, he helped pick where my daughters went to college. And
wow.
He just was great at counsel and advice. We'd go to breakfast or we'd go to lunch. I remember some of those mentoring lessons. I remember one time telling one of my mentors about a employee that wasn't doing what I wanted him to do. Like, I'd been giving him like super vague instructions, which I didn't realize. I thought it was probably perfect. And the employee wasn't doing it. His name was Henry. And so I'm talking to my mentor. I said, Henry did this and Henry did that. And I think I'm going to have to get rid of Henry. What do you think about Henry? And the mentor looked at me and he said, Norris, he said, I think if you want to know what the problem is, you should go look in the mirror.
Wow.
But remember, I had this trusting relationship where my job is to listen to him. So I'm like, what are you talking about? And then he went on to explain, let's look at the quality of the direction you're giving this guy. He's trying. You're the one not getting it done. So I just had to learn all that. So I want to give that same thing to the people here. Like, I always tell them, it's like, I'm teaching you everything I know, but there's more that you need to know. And let's go get Joe the mentor and let him work with you too.
The more I think about what you're doing there, the more impressed I am. Because I think, first of all, you're investing in your people, which means you're going to get a better output because they're going to be a better employee. But there's also this like psychological component. And as I'm trying to emulate what you do, and I'm starting to roll this out with some of my key team members, the reaction they have is almost universally pride. Where it's like, hey, he sees something in me and he wants to invest in me. And I see that with your people. And I think it's a really interesting, I wonder why more people don't do that, because it is a really cool way to kind of not only sort of build a better employee, but also you're building that cohesion too, right? They're going to be more loyal to you because you're investing in them.
We've got a lot of people here on the leadership team that have been here a long time, and they really, for the most part, haven't hardly worked anywhere else. We need that outside influence so they know more than what we collectively know at BluePrint. There's more to be known than what we know at BluePrint. So let's get them with somebody that can teach them those other things. For the most part, I see really, really fantastic growth and change in the individuals that get mentored. When we started doing it, it wasn't super well received. It was like, you're picking me out because I'm the slow kid, right? It's like, no, you're not the slow kid. I see things in you that I want to help you grow, and they're not things I can teach you because I don't know them. I need somebody else to teach you something else. But then once the ball got rolling and people started seeing the growth in those individuals that were being mentored, that's when everybody said, I want one. I'd like to be mentored too, because I see him or her or whatever, and she's really growing a lot and she's taking on more responsibility. She talks different and she's changed her approach to things because they're learning. Everybody sees that and they go, I want to do that. We're not going to win any awards for this. I mean, we do it. We could do better at it, the mentoring. But now we're challenging that top level of leadership. You mentor somebody else in the company that's not in your downline. So like my engineering manager is mentoring my warehouse manager that's been here 1 year. So the engineering manager has nothing to do with warehouse management, but he meets with him once or twice a month. They go out to lunch. They talk about how to navigate BluePrint. They talk about where we're headed, find ways to help. I want to turn my people into mentors too. Get mentored, be a mentor.
I assume you're a fairly large organization. So I assume you have like an HR team.
Yes.
Is there like a structure to this, or is it more like a loose kind of someone raises their hand or a manager points at an employee and says, I think this person needs it? Like, how do you facilitate it?
It's loose, and it can be loose today because me and the people that I work with all the time that are really on board, we see enough and know enough of the people. But once we get to the point where there's really awesome people here and they don't get noticed, then we need a different path because we won't catch them all.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I don't know if you're comfortable talking about this on the show, and if you're not, no problem. You've also done something interesting with some of your key kind of leadership team members where you've actually allowed them to kind of buy into the company. What's the story on that? Because I think that's interesting too.
We've been here for 42 years. I'm 62, I think. I've got 4 great kids and a bunch of grandkids, but none of those family members are in the business at all, and they're probably not going to be. So I've got to face the reality that someday I'll need to sell this, and hopefully I'll sell it and not my wife after I die, right? So I did enough research 5 years ago, how you get rid of a business and who you can sell it to, and learned about strategic buyers and private equity buyers. And I also learned about employee ownership to create a path. And there's no guarantee this is how it's going to end, but to create a path, my wife and I decided to sell about 10% of the stock in the company. And we ended up with a group of about a dozen employees that purchased stock. And it's not phantom stock. It's not an ESOP. They literally, 11 out of the 12 went to the bank, borrowed money, and have an annual payment on their stock loan. And it stretched them out a lot, which I'm really proud of their commitment. I patterned our program after a construction company in Omaha called Kiewit, which is a multi-billion-dollar construction company that is owned by the employees. And one of the attributes of it that I really like is the employees ultimately get wealthy. And I think it's important to really have that carrot out there that if you come in here and buy stock and sweat it out, make those payments, continue to buy more stock when you can. By the time you're 50 or 60, if you had a high-level job, you're going to own enough stock that you're going to be rich. And I think that's a real motivator for people. The nice part, I remember when I was talking to my employees about it, they don't know, right? It's kind of weird. It's like, what are you selling stock for? Are you okay? Is everything all right? And I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. I'm just making a path for the future. And a lot of them said, I don't want to do this unless I know you're going to be here for at least 5 years, because they saw me as the engine that kind of kept it all going, right? So I boosted my ego. One of the guys that I sold stock to said, Norris, he said, I'm going to buy the stock, but I don't know how I could work harder for you than I already do. He said, so don't expect anything to change.
That's honest.
And I said, hey, buddy, I said, here's the difference. you're not going to be working for me. You're going to be working for you. And it did change. And it is a different attitude when he's working for himself. So it's a path. I don't know if that's how we'll ultimately dispose of the company. Whatever disposal method I take, these stockholders will get the same thing I get. They should make money on their stock. No problem.
There's a couple things, and you and I have talked about this a little bit. I've thought about it before today's conversation, and there's a couple things about what you did there that I think are pretty brilliant. So first of all, by going to your key people, you're kind of locking them in, right? Like I think you sell them shares of the company and they have a real vested interest, in not leaving. So that makes sense. I also love that you didn't give them the stock. I think I've seen some companies that'll do that. They'll like gift ghost stock or whatever. And the fact that you made them stretch and you made it hurt, that is so much more implied value because they had to pay. Like nobody ever respects something they were handed for free, right? That's why you make kids do chores to get the allowance, right? Like they got to earn it. The fact that they had to stretch to do it, I think long-term, short-term probably hurt a little bit and there were probably some tough dinner conversations in those houses, but long-term, there's way more value to that because they have to write that check every year and they know they're investing in their future. So it's really a smart move.
They're very committed. Some of them are stretched out pretty good. I always offer to, have them bring their spouse in and talk about it. I use the same attorney law firm that this company in Omaha uses. So a lot of what we ended up with for an agreement has really been banged out for the last 30 years at this construction company. And it's interesting that the agreement is like 150% in my favor. And I always say, you got to take this agreement and I want you to go to your attorney and he's going to tell you this is really in Norris's favor and we need to change it. And I'm just going to tell you, we're not going to change it. And the attorneys usually end up saying, as long as you trust Norris, this is a good agreement.
I was about to say, this is almost like a financial trust fall, too. If they don't trust you and they're not willing to kind of go all in, then that probably tells you. Have you ever had anyone say no and decline it?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay. And did they stay with the company or?
Ultimately, no, but those two actions were not related. One higher level employee said, well, you got this vesting period and you got this retirement age. And he said, I don't want to work that long. He said, I don't think it's a very good deal for me. That's fine. And he did leave earlier and he is retired now. And, that's cool. I did have another individual that was a high level leader on the leadership team. And she just didn't think it was a very good investment. She left and that's fine. I look at it like, hey, some people have really poor judgment.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's sort of a leading indicator, right? Because if they aren't willing to buy in, then they're probably not a lifer. So maybe you can just take that and put it in your back pocket and say, okay, I know that now.
So we have a formula that's super simple. It's just like 6 times EBITDA. Rolling 3-year average. Very simple. We've been in this stock program now for about 6 years, and the stock is more than doubled. The word is out. So now I get people coming to me either wanting to buy for the first time or wanting to buy more, which is cool. So it's a little bit of been a good ride. So it's not as risky for people to buy more. They see how it works and they're hopeful that it'll continue to grow.
I'm grateful, and I think the listeners will be grateful to you for being this transparent and talking about this, because I think anyone who's been paying attention to the aftermarket for the last couple of years has seen that the other sort of exit strategy for a lot of founders, which is the PE thing, and we work with a lot of PE companies and some of them are good, but like it has not universally been super successful for our industry, for the employees and the consumers and the people that are left behind. So I think just having these conversations out loud about like there are other options, I think is really healthy and productive.
What I learned when I started doing the research 5 years ago or 8 was that private equity is probably the best buyer to sell to maximize what I get for Norris. That's the way to get the most for Norris. And the other methods probably won't produce that. But I figured out after weighing all that, it's like, well, why wouldn't you want the most, right? That's such an easy answer. It's like, well, of course we want the most. That's what we're going to do. But I figured out that the legacy of the company was actually more important to me than the most. We got these great people here, not trying to protect their jobs. They need to protect their jobs with their performance. But we spent so much time building this organization. Why wouldn't we want it to have a chance to keep growing instead of kind of just getting frozen in time and stripped down, right? And then 10 years later, 3 more PE buyers later, it's a shell. It's like, well, I don't want to watch that. Let's at least give it a chance to keep going. And there are some great companies that are old that have kept going. I look at Mala as an example, and they have a really unique ownership, which is like some foundation in Germany owns Mala that's controlled by a town or a church or a hospital or something. And they just tell them, keep the money, keep growing the company, and we're doing fine. It's like, well, that's going to grow into perpetuity. So I kind of like to think about how can we make this so it has a chance to just perpetually go on and not get encumbered.
I love love that. And, you're also, I think it probably helps that you're in a pretty small town and you're a pretty big employer in that town. So I think probably the community probably looks to you too. So it's cool that you think about that kind of stuff.
We care about the community and want to do our share and know how that works.
So shifting gears a little bit here, let's talk for a minute about Origin, because that's another one of your businesses that I think is really interesting. You touched on it a few minutes ago. So
yeah,
basically the same production line, right? Same kind of
yep.
line, similar engines. Can you kind of give a rundown of what those products are?
If we look at our 6.2 liter engine for Origin, in BluePrint we call it a 383. We use cubic inches. In Origin we use liters, but it's pretty much the same engine block. We probably drill more holes and tap more holes for BluePrint, so it's more universal. In Origin we just drill the holes that we need to bolt the motor mount on or whatever. But it's still the 6.2 engine block. It still gets the 3.750 stroke crankshaft. It's the same crankshaft. It's probably going to get different pistons for compression. It's going to get a different camshaft, of course, because the operating RPM will be different. The cylinder heads will be outfitted with valves to run on propane or natural gas. At the end of the day, Dan, those parts all look alike. And when you put a piston in or hook up a crankshaft or a connecting rod, it's the same tools, it's the same bolts. So when we build the long block engine, you kind of got to look at the tag to see if it's going to be a BluePrint engine or an Origin. There's other ways to tell, but I mean, it looks a lot alike.
And you're doing other stuff too, right? Like a 4-cylinder, I think, right? And is there a 6-cylinder on that line?
In Origin, we start off at 3.6 liters. That's a 4-cylinder. And we go up to our 632, which is a 10.3 liter.
That's the big, huge, what is that, is that a V12 or something? I saw that there. That's like a huge.
That's bigger yet. So that's an Origin only engine that we are working with a company in India. It's a V12 24-liter diesel engine that we showed the Indian engineers how to turn it into a natural gas engine. They only make diesel. This is a true statement. They don't hardly have natural gas in India. They don't grow up there knowing how to build natural gas engines. So they decided they wanted to have this engine as a natural gas engine, sell it in the United States, use it in power generation. We said, what did you do? And they showed us what they did to convert it. It's like, you did that wrong. So here, myself and my head of engineering, Chris Larson, are teaching all these Indian engineers how to do this the right way. And we rebuilt it, got it converted the right way. It makes 525 kilowatts of power. So just a half a meg, it'll power a small village. And it's just really cool.
And it's huge. I mean, for the listeners, I've seen this thing in person and it's got to be, I don't know, like 8 feet long or bigger. I mean, it's giant. It's a huge engine like you'd see in a Caterpillar or something. What is the use of something like that? Is that like a job site generator on like a tractor or trailer, or is that like a hospital generator? Like, what do you do with something that big?
Could be a hospital generator. It could run a small factory. When we started on the project, there were a lot of them used in oil and gas production. They need power on a well site. They have natural gas coming out of the ground for free. So they'll put these huge generators on that and power up all the equipment on a well site. That was our original intent. The oil and gas business has changed a little bit, so there's not a lot of market for it today, but it'll come back.
On the Origin side, what was the timeline on that? Is that something that kind of happened at the same time as BluePrint, or was that like an extension after BluePrint was up and running?
It was an extension after BluePrint was up and running. GM has always done, at least for 20, 30 years, they've been the primary provider for industrial engines in the marketplace. So if you go look at a genset, it's probably got a Chevy 350 engine in it or a big block Chevy. One of the things that happened was GM started discontinuing those engines. The first one was their production engine. It was an 8.1 V8 that they used, a big engine, and they discontinued it. And the market for industrial engines used it a lot. So we talked to some of those customers that were converting that GM engine into an industrial engine and said, what are you going to do? And they said, we don't know. We don't have a solution. And I said, well, we can make an 8.1 liter engine. So that was the beginning of Origin, but it really tags along with BluePrint because the components are so much the same. The vendors where we get those components are so much the same. Origin has a lot of engineering in it because they're EPA certified. So we have an emissions lab on site, engineers here that have gone to college to learn how to work on engines and manage them. We can calibrate an engine and pick out a catalyst and get an engine to pass the EPA and then certify it. And then the customers for Origin are different. You said you bought a couple of my engines. I didn't even know you bought them until you told me. You didn't come to me and say, you need to change this and do that. We sell major OEMs, these engines for generators. These are big brand name companies and they're manufacturers and they tell us how it's going to be. I don't mind that because I think it makes us better as a manufacturer. They have certain requirements. and it's really tight. I mean, like we can't change components. Like if we run out of brand X rod bearings, we can't just put somebody else's rod bearings in it. There's a whole approval process and testing that goes on before you can do that. So I think Origin is harder than BluePrint, and it makes us better, and it spills over into BluePrint, and it makes BluePrint better too.
Are the majority of those Origin engines running on propane and natural gas? Is that sort of the...
That is the majority, and the majority of them go into a genset, a brand new generator.
Is that because it's cleaner from an emission standpoint, or it's more reliable? Like, or is it just like in that application, there's usually a natural gas line or a propane tank available and not a gas tank somewhere?
That's a good question. I think it's certainly more economical than gasoline. I think propane is probably equivalent to a couple bucks a gallon or something like that for gasoline. So it's more economical. It stores, as far as I know, forever. There are a lot of diesel generators, and you can go ask your diesel supplier, do you ever go pump those out and replace the diesel? And he said, oh yeah, after 4 years we change it out. So diesel has a shelf life, gets contaminated, whatever happens to it. But propane I don't think does, and natural gas, it comes from a pipe. So
I remember when I was growing up, my dad and my grandpa had a forklift at their business that had an Iron Duke that was converted to run on propane. They ran that thing for 40 years and never rebuilt it. And like it ran so clean, it just ran, like never really had an issue. So I always thought that was sort of interesting that it never needed a rebuild, never needed a top end, just kept on going. With that in mind, so you've got your performance division that's doing everything from pretty standard replacement small block Chevys all the way up to some pretty exotic supercharged LS motors making huge power numbers. You've got Origin doing all sorts of natural gas and propane powered things, everything from little 4-cylinder wood chipper motors to that giant V12 we were talking about. Meanwhile, you're on the SEMA board of directors, and I don't want you to speak on behalf of SEMA. I'd like you to speak on behalf of your businesses, but you're obviously probably more awareness of what's going on in the market than the average person. All this talk, especially because we're in such a political climate right now about all the state where I am sitting right now is trying to outlaw ICE, and obviously the free market has kind of whacked back at that a little bit this year. But there's been a lot of talk over the last couple of years about how internal combustion's going away, everything's going to be EV. You're in the internal combustion business. What's your take? Where do you see it going? What do you think? Is that true? Is that fear mongering?
It didn't bother me that the OEMs thought battery electric was going to be the hot ticket. It just meant they were going to make fewer engines, and I still have customers that need engines. So that's okay. Regulations coming out of California and the regulations coming out of the EPA were just astounding at how quickly they expected all this to happen. And I think the Fords and GMs of the world didn't have any choice but to go along with it. And they got on board and tried to get it there and found out the first year of increased production that there's not a market for these. People won't buy them. Dan, I remember a few years ago, I finally realized that this goal of making all these cars electric, all the infrastructure we need, I just assumed somebody knew those two things had to come together, right? I really did. I thought they're working on both, right? Somebody knows we need more infrastructure.
I think you're giving the politicians a lot more credit than they're due, but okay.
And then I finally realized there is no plan. I mean, you could have 10-year-old Boy Scouts come up with a much better plan than what our government has. Like, we're going to do all this and make all these BEVs. And I used to sit around and do the calculations on how many gallons of gasoline are burnt and convert that into kW. And it's like, okay, we need twice the power generation that we have, twice the distribution. It's like, if we were getting that, you'd be reading newspaper articles about people bitching about power lines and bitching about nuclear power plants or coal or something, because we're not doing anything to expand how much power we make. So we get all done with this 2024, the year that the car makers figure out this is baloney. Nobody wants to buy these. They're not in the volumes that we're told we have to make them. So they're like backpedaling and saying, well, we just want to make what people want to buy. That's cool. That's good. You still got this regulatory problem that says 60% by 2030 or whatever the number is need to be EV. And now, icing on the cake, I'm reading in the last week about Microsoft buying power from 3 Mile Island. I'm reading Wall Street Journal articles about how AI is going to take more electricity than we can fathom. There's still no plan. I mean, if they'd have made all them EVs and we had AI, we don't have the power for both. We don't have the power for one of them. Just to do one of them the way they want to do it, we don't have the power for. But we're going to do both at the same time.
You have the engineer perspective, and unfortunately, I don't think they do.
Too much common sense.
Yeah, you're actually trying to figure out how this is all supposed to work. You're not supposed to ask those questions. You're supposed to just nod and say, okay.
Our challenge is just to always stay nimble enough to figure out where the opportunity is, right? The opportunity changes. It's not the same. But like today, making engines for generators is a really good gig because the generator guys think that they're going to be part of the solution. There's not enough power. The grid's going to be unreliable. People will need more generators. So it's like, perfect. This is great. Plug them cars in. We'll sell you a generator.
Well, it's interesting. I remember, because like you, I grew up reading Carcraft and Hot Rod. I mean, I literally learned to reading car magazines. And I remember in the early 90s, Jeff Smith was the editor of Hot Rod. And he was, I think, the first guy to take a GM multi-port TPI system and convert it to an old car. And I happened to grow up in the same neighborhood as Jeff. And I was at some cruise night and he pulled in his Chevelle and everybody acted like a spaceship had landed in the middle of the car show. Like it was so weird that this guy had a factory current model year EFI system on his 64 Chevelle. And like the thought of putting like a catalyst on an old car was totally alien. It was like, we were just sawzalling that stuff off. Like, what are you talking about? And today, and I'd like you to maybe talk about this, like EFI has become so normalized now in the performance market that it's almost weird not to have EFI. It's become common. Like it's like a normal thing now. So I do think that like the technology is trickling down and people are getting more, there is like a comfort level, I think, but it takes a surprisingly long time because that was 30 years ago that Jeff did that. So do you think, is there room for this kind of thing where they're becoming like factory? You can go get a new car at a dealership right now, 600 or 700 horsepower, and it's not even that big of a deal. Is that going to work its way into the aftermarket and into the crate engine business as well?
I think so. Super silly, right? It's bragging rights because you can't really hook it up, but people want big horsepower and they want to say that they have big horsepower. So I think superchargers are really good for that. We lean towards superchargers rather than turbos because we can package a supercharger and know it's going to fit most places, where turbos is like, it's like a custom installation, right? I can give you the turbos and some elbows, but I don't know how it's going to fit in your car. And if you do it right, it'll produce the same numbers as I did on the dyno. And if you do it wrong, it won't. Superchargers are good. We see a lot of future for superchargers, and we probably in the next year will come out with some upgrade packages for some 2010, 2012 Camaro kind of cars. And we think those engines are probably wore out and we want to sell them a new engine with a supercharger. And it will be all EO'd and completely legal and just fine to do, but it'll give you another option besides just a replacement engine.
So on that note, I was hoping we would kind of get to this. For the listeners who aren't aware, because this gets a little wonky, for a long time, SEMA was working on a problem where, 20 years ago, whatever, companies like Dynacorn came out with these new bodies. And there was like a challenge because if you're like a car builder and you go buy a brand new 69 Camaro or 57 Chevy body, then you call up the Roadster Shop guys or whatever, Heights, one of these, suspension companies, and you buy a chassis. I think the consumer thinks you can just get that body and get that chassis and bolt them together and put a motor in it and put an interior in it and go down to the DMV and get a title and you've got yourself a really cool hot rod. And that is not how the law worked. There was you built essentially a brand new car, and that's a hard thing to title. And so SEMA passed something called Low Volume Manufacturers Act all the way back in 2015. And basically, and I was on the board at the time and said, hey, and they had to work with regulators. And it was a huge, like typical DC thing. It was kind of a cluster, but they got it figured out. They got it in the highway bill. They got it signed. It became technically law that, hey, now there's a path to do that. And there's some stipulations and some rules around it. 9 years later, we're only now finally at a point where that is theoretically possible. And you're a big part of the reason why. Can you explain kind of like why it's taken 9 years to get to a point where people can do this legally and kind of the powertrain part of it? Because it's been kind of a sticky point up to this point.
We like the law. We think it's great. Been following along, wanted to be an engine supplier for people building brand new cars. You're right. They're Mustangs and Camaros and Broncos and things like that. They're replica vehicles. They have to be a replica. I know there was a lot of holdup from NHTSA, where NHTSA had to create some regulations or check the box. I believe we ended up having to sue NHTSA to get them to perform and do their job. So the law's got a little dichotomy in it where it's like, okay, you're building a replica of an old car. Even though it's a 2024 Bronco, it's based on a 69. It does not need to meet 2024 safety standards. So that was a great win. That was awesome that we got it that way, because talk about making the bar high.
That would be impossible. I think a car builder's not putting side curtain airbags and stuff like that in us.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Get the little cameras that stop when you get close to hitting somebody. So don't have to meet current model year safety standards, but you do have to meet current model year emission standards. And I think the intention and the hope was the car companies will sign up, Ford will pull an engine out of a Mustang and make it available, and Chevrolet will pull an engine out of a Camaro and make it available, and that's how it's going to work. But the reality is the car companies aren't standing in line to do this. They're so factory engineered orientated. The first thing I'm going to tell you is, well, the ECM's wrong. We made that ECM for this GVW vehicle, and we don't want to recalibrate it. We don't want to change it. So what really became the case is that the OEMs need somebody to take their engine and do the work to get it to work. Take it out of a F-150 pickup and get it to work in a Bronco that's a third less weight. So that's where we come in. So today, BluePrint and Automotive Consulting Services, which is Rob Simons, and Ford are all working together to take an F-150 engine and get it CARB certified to use in a replica Bronco, replica Cobra, whatever. And it really does take all three of us working together, because there's things we need from Ford to do this that we couldn't do it without Ford, without some engineering support. It's not a lot, but we have to get some access. We have to give somebody some access to the ECM that they don't want to give. So they have to want it to happen. And we're very lucky the people from Ford that we work with do want it to happen. They were just out here a couple of weeks ago. We've been working on this with them for like 2 years. Ringing the bell. It's almost done. It's almost done. It's like, yeah, bullshit. It ain't done. But we keep finding hurdles and we don't stop working on it, and it will get done. And there will be brand new VIN code Cobras and Broncos for sure, because we're talking to those kind of manufacturers today. They're just waiting for it. We need an engine is what they tell me.
That's so cool. And I really see the value in that, because first of all, you get a new Coyote motor. They're making a lot of power. They look cool. They're reliable. You know, if you're some guy that wants to go commission a build on a brand new 65 Mustang or a brand new 69 Camaro, or 69 Bronco, and you can get a motor in it with 400 something horsepower and it runs clean, that seems like kind of a win-win. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's great that SEMA got that done. That's a really cool check the box thing that SEMA has done. The slow part has not been because of SEMA. It's just because it's hard. Probably some of the original companies that were going to make cars gone on and do something else, but new ones have come in. So there's still a handful of builders that intend to make some cars. The most they can make and qualify under this law is 325 replicas a year.
Which for a build shop is a lot.
That's a lot. And most of the customers we're talking to are not at that level. They're hoping to make 20 or 30 or whatever. But it could change when you have this opportunity.
That's really cool. That's interesting. You know, you've given us a little bit of a kind of sneak peek inside your businesses and your culture and all that. And I think that's great. Can you share with us, just as a businessman who's done a lot, and we haven't even gotten into all your community involvement, but I know you're heavily involved in a lot of community causes too, which I think is really cool. What, as you kind of think back on your career and you look forward to the next few years of what you're doing next, what piece of advice would you give entrepreneurs who are listening today that respect what you've built?
There's lots of advice, right? But one thing that I always remember is that I learned from is that there will be some really challenging and difficult times. They're the kind of difficult times where if you quit, your mom would say, oh, well, I'm glad you stopped doing that. That looked like it was really hard for you. And your buddies would all say, let's go get a beer. You should have quit. That was a terrible thing that was going on. That was too hard to overcome. We don't blame you. When you get to those moments and you don't quit, you separate yourself from about probably 85, 90% of all the other entrepreneurs. And I've had those moments where it's like, this does not work worth it. Crap. Just put my head down and just keep going. And as soon as you make that decision to put your head down and keep going, it gets easier. You get clarity because you're no longer wondering whether you're doing the right thing. You're just going to do it. I'm just going to do it. I would say don't quit when it's okay to quit is really separates long-term success from the short-term.
No truer words have been spoken. I completely agree with that. And that's a perfect segue into a question I ask every guest. Unfortunately, I wish I was born with more intellect than I was, but I seem to learn all my lessons the hard way. So the question I like to ask every guest is, if you think back on kind of your career and your business and your arc, what's the biggest mistake that you can think of that you made? And what did you learn from it?
Biggest mistake I made, unlike the guy that you're interviewing today, when I started in business, Dan, I did not put a lot of value on personal relationships. I wanted to be judged by performance and performance only. And I thought if we do a good job and we perform well, we'll get the customer. I learned that I was wrong about that. Personal relationships are very important. Now that I figured out they're important, we become good at it. 25 years ago, we were not good at it, and I didn't value it, and I didn't think it mattered. I thought, I'm just going to do a good job, and they're going to buy stuff from me because of that. And I've learned that, no, there's a lot more to it. Having a big circle of friends and acquaintances makes life easier. You can get introductions done. Spend that time being involved with SEMA. Spend that time going to socially things. Get to know people. Put yourself out there. I didn't know any of that, and I was 100% wrong.
Wow, that's a great one. Thank you.
I was just really wrong about it. I'll tell you that.
Well, you're doing a good job now. So I think you must be on the gas. I like it. Well, Norris, this has been a pleasure. As we wrap up, where can people find more about you and about your companies?
Well, of course, we have a website, Dan, BluePrintEngines.com. And there's a lot on there. I'm on LinkedIn also. And you can just Google Norris Marshall, Kearney, Nebraska, and you'll get quite a bit.
Call information, just like Jack Rouse.
Yeah,
right?
call information.
Very good. And you've got some pretty good social channels too. So if people are interested in your product, they can go on Facebook and Instagram and all that too, right?
Thanks to our relationship with Con Media.
Hey, we're working on it. Well, that is a wrap for this episode of Only the Strong Survive. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a review on this episode. If you would like to get alerted for new podcast episodes, sign up for our free Substack or follow us on social at OTSS Podcast. Thank you again to Norris Marshall for joining us, and I'll see you next time.